he always used to say, God's not in his heaven and all's not right with the world. Well, to me, you see, he always seemed to me to have the right idea. I always thought, frankly, it was a point well taken. But should we get off the very boring subject of me? I'm not interesting. You can sum me up in about 10 words. A former student of English literature who went downhill from there. Oh, for God's sake. For God's sake, no. Now, I'm serious, honestly. Let's forget me, and let's talk about someone who actually is interesting. Let's talk about someone we can all revere. Now, that would be enjoyable. In other words, yes. Let's talk about Howard. But, now, what can I say about such a fascinating subject? How should I begin to tell you about this remarkable man who responded so sensitively to the most obscure verses and also to the cries of the miserable and the downtrodden, sometimes virtually at the same instant without ever leaving his breakfast table? I mean, if I'm going to speak of Howard, what should come first? What should be the very first thing that I ought to say? I mean, I really ought to say many different things simultaneously because he was just so outstanding in so many ways. But that's not possible. So what can I do? What the hell? Let's just calm down. I have to start somewhere. So, well, all right. I'll start by describing one of Howard's truly most exceptional qualities. Well, let's just call it his capacity for, contempt. Yes, good. So, all right. Howard's capacity for contempt. Now, really, that is really the subject for a lengthy monograph. I can only just sketch it, a superficial sketch, but it really is a good place to begin because Howard's capacity for contempt was so, incredibly vast. I mean, he really had contempt for pretty much everybody on Earth. Isn't that absolutely wonderful?
Oh, all right, my darling. Hold my hand for a moment.
An apostle, you see, of universal love. But flying through each particular day on wings of scorn, as some amusing wag said of someone once. Oh, it was impressive, really.
Oh, God, I had to laugh when I heard what Tom was saying on the radio. I really laughed.
It was wonderful the way he could draw us all into it. Pretty soon, we'd all be laughing.
He was chattering, of course, to Eddie. And all of a sudden, to Eddie's surprise, he was giving his famous views on morality again.
Howard's contempt didn't come out of nowhere, of course. I mean, you had to understand that over the years, and a bit more each year, you could say, I suppose, poor Howard had really been frightfully mistreated in every possible way. Why, it was just outrageous. A month after his very favorite little tea house in the park had been closed for good, they actually cut down his favorite grove of trees. And I mean, that's just one example. So, naturally, this was an angry man.
So immediately Eddie got very, very serious. Oh, yes, very serious. Well, you know how he gets. His lips get sort of stuck in place, like this, so his voice is sort of...
Now, one of Judy's problems, I'm sorry to say, was that she refused to wear clothes in front of her father, which I, as her husband, found somehow always vaguely unnerving. Her usual outfit around the house was this rather well-worn pair of ratty old trousers, some bright red lipstick, and a rather frilly brassiere. The trousers and lipstick never varied. But the brassiere would be forgotten on certain occasions, which meant that she was sometimes topless. All right. You think I'm a prude. But one of the main reasons it bothered me, honestly, was that as Howard, of course, always went around in his bedclothes and dressing gown, it meant that usually I was the only one dressed. I mean, that was a little unfair, don't you think so? I was the one who felt out of place. I felt out of place because I was dressed.
Shall I tell you about the first time I met the very amusing and extraordinarily long-lived president of our country? I was about 6 years old, and I was strolling happily through the park with my nurse, running off the pathways every few moments to chase a squirrel or a bird. And all of a sudden, we passed the president, also strolling with a huge entourage. He was heavily guarded in those days, obviously. Well, as soon as we passed, he ran back towards me with his whole group following confusedly behind him. And he came right up to me. And he was sort of pretending to be a cat, with his hands held up by his ears like paws, and he was sort of purring and meowing. And all of a sudden, he laughed loudly and instructed me, "Now give your father my very best regards. Don't forget. My best regards." And then he laughed again, and they were all gone. So can anyone say what the difference is between poetry and prose? Well, you might say poetry comes in those short little lines. Isn't that the difference? Well, all right. All right, let's say it is, but can you tell me then how the length of the line could possibly affect the way the words convey meaning? Do the words care what size of line they're on? But all the same, this indefinable difference had some very definable results in my life over the years, in my opinion. You know, I always think of this drunken friend of father's leaning over me sickeningly at some party or other when I was 10 or 11, saying, "Yes, it's a miracle, really, he's allowed to exist. It's just remarkable that your father is allowed to exist." Well, do you think he would have been allowed to exist past the age of 30 if he hadn't completely given up writing prose and devoted himself entirely to the writing of verse? It was just the way his talent developed, but it meant that the charming little gang who led our country never read what he wrote. As the only members of the gang who could understand poetry at all were undoubtedly father's own father and our playful president himself, who, out of respect for his old comrade in arms, my appalling grandfather, undoubtedly made the decision just to look the other way.